Hello, I'm Dr. Richard Scott Nokes, professor of medieval literature at Troy University. And today I'm going to show you a real medieval manuscript up close and give you a glimpse of what manuscript scholars look for when we're examining a medieval manuscript. We'll look at some of the common tools, talk about how manuscripts were made, and how we can see history played out on the tiny holes and blemishes that are in a manuscript. So, here is the medieval manuscript we're going to be examining today. Now, it contains several legal texts, including a copy of the famous Magna Carta. Now, before we even open it, there are a few things you might notice. First, many people are surprised by the size of medieval manuscripts. In the movies, they're often quite large, and although a few medieval manuscripts are bigger in size, most are pretty compact like this. Now, there's some real practical reasons for that, but probably the most important is that the pages of medieval manuscripts are typically made from the skins of animals. If you made a book too large, then you couldn't use smaller animal skins, and you might have a lot of wasted bits of those valuable animal skins left over. Second, you might also notice how well preserved the cover of this particular volume looks. In fact, most medieval covers have a great deal of dirt and damage because, of course, the job of a book cover is to take a beating so that the contents remain safe. Actually, in this case, the cover isn't medieval at all. This manuscript was put in this particular binding in 1989, though we can see that the bookbinder tried to honor the manuscript by giving it a really beautiful medieval-style binding, not just a utilitarian one. Finally, you might be surprised to find that several different law books are bound together in a single manuscript. This is also pretty common practice, and in order to understand this, we need to understand a little about what a manuscript is. So most of the time, when we use the word book in common conversation, we mean something like a volume of cardboard and paper that opens and closes along one edge. But that's not actually a book at all. That's something that we would technically call a codex. Now, by the way, the plural form of codex is codices, so you might hear me say that occasionally. Now, books are the information that is found within them, whereas the codex is the physical object itself, like this or like this. Now, a good analogy to help you understand this is the difference between, say, an album and a CD. An album is the information that's found on a CD, the songs themselves. So a vinyl record, a cassette tape, a CD, or an audio file can all contain the exact same album. In the same way, a scroll, a codex, an audio file in the case of an audiobook, or an EPUB file can all contain the exact same book. Now, up until the early Christian era, scrolls were the dominant way to produce books. Early Christians, though, took to using codices very early. And with Christianity's strong emphasis on literacy and particularly reproducing the Bible, with the spread of Christianity came the spread of the codex. Now, most of the time, we call codices produced in the Middle Ages manuscripts. The word manuscript literally just means written by hand. And until Johannes Gutenberg developed the printing press in the 1450s, every book had to be copied by hand into codices. After the development of the printing press, codices could be printed in mass quantities, so every copy of an edition of a book would be the exact same as every other copy of that edition. With manuscripts, though, each and every copy is its own unique artifact. Even without small flaws and copy errors, each one is different based on everything from the handwriting style of the copyist to the places where the different line breaks are on the page. Take, for example, your favorite book from the last century. If we find a new copy of the first edition, it might be valuable, but we probably won't learn anything new from it. It should be the exact same as every other copy of the first edition. On the other hand, when we find a new medieval manuscript, it has the opportunity to teach us new things because the object itself is unique. Okay, so what about this particular medieval manuscript? Well, because one of the statutes in it wasn't passed until 1342, we know that it couldn't be any older than that. And because normally you would try to keep a legal book like this as up to date as possible, we really strongly suspect that it was produced in 1344 or very soon thereafter. So let's put this manuscript in historical context. The Magna Carta, which is the second text in this manuscript, was first drafted in 1215. So this manuscript was copied over a century later. Now, the Magna Carta was already an important historical document, so what we have here is similar perhaps to a law book today that might include the US Constitution because of its historical and legal importance. The first printing press would be brought to England in 1476 by William Caxton, so there's no way this could have been a printed book. In fact, this particular manuscript was transcribed at around the halfway point between the drafting of the Magna Carta and the first printing presses to come to England. Okay, so now before we actually open the manuscript and look inside, let's look at a few of the common tools that a manuscript scholar will use. Now, of course, here we have a pencil. Some scholars will use a set of colored pencils so they can sketch the image in their notes, matching the colors on the manuscript. One important thing to know about handling medieval manuscripts is that usually you would not allow ink anywhere near them, because even a small smudge off your finger could create confusion for scholars who might come after you. So for that reason, you would usually use either an electronic device to take notes or write them in pencil in a notebook. Now, some medieval manuscript reading rooms will search your bags when you enter, and they're looking really for two things, aside from maybe food: pens that could unintentionally damage a manuscript, and blades. Unfortunately, dishonest people have sometimes used blades to slice beautiful pages from manuscripts and sell them on the black market. Now, you can legally buy manuscript pages at a private collector, but if you ever do, make sure that you get the provenance or origins of the manuscript page. Otherwise, you could be putting money in the pocket of someone who's defaced a valuable and irreplaceable medieval manuscript. Now here, we have a bone folder. This is simply a piece of bone, usually from cattle, that's made into a tool for pointing, counting lines, sometimes holding a page down, and so forth. They typically have a very dull point that doesn't offer much risk to the manuscript unless you were to intentionally try to deface it. Now, although you can sometimes get a Teflon or plastic folder bone today, I'm a traditionalist, so mine is made from cow bone. Now, when I need to point at something small on the page, rather than using a pen or even the pencil that might mark the manuscript, you'll notice I'll be using the bone folder. Now, this, of course, obviously is a magnifying glass. Sometimes it can be hard to see small markings on a manuscript. Most of the time, we use these or pocket microscopes, but for places where we need to look really closely, we can use the binary microscopes. For measurement, I prefer to use a cloth tape measure rather than a ruler. The main reason is that sometimes I want to lay something across a curved page without trying to press the codex flat and potentially damaging it. Though, of course, a regular ruler will do fine as long as you are careful with it. Now, I'm not going to bother to measure it today on camera. I can already tell you this is about 158 by 133 millimeters, or about 4 by 6 inches. Now, and finally, something you might expect, but is not here: gloves. Many people think that we use gloves when handling medieval manuscripts, but usually we do not. The main reason we don't use gloves is for the safety of the manuscript. Your fingers are very sensitive, and you can feel with your fingertips if you're handling a page too roughly. Gloves limit your tactile senses, and so in most cases, it's actually safer for you to touch the manuscript with your fingers. Now, in those cases where a library insists on scholars wearing gloves, they're typically white cotton gloves, and so many scholars will bring their own cotton gloves rather than use those that are supplied by the library to get the best possible fit, because the better the fit, the better you can feel if you're handling a brittle page a little too roughly. Now, obviously, you want to make sure that your hands are clean and dry, that you don't have any kinds of lotions on them or oils that might damage the manuscript. Okay, so let's start looking at the details of this manuscript. Okay. All right, so let's open it up here. The first page of a manuscript, this first page is called the flyleaf. And on this particular page, we have all sorts of clues as to the provenance of the manuscript. Now, the word provenance means where something comes from. And although we don't know who the first owner was, we can see that a series of owners have put their names in the book. Here at the top is Robert Dacres in 1532. Below that, we have David Constable in 1817. Is given to someone named TJ. We don't know who that is. We have Joe Watson here with a Latin inscription that says, "To all things there is a season." Other scholars have been able to date this figure, Joe Watson, to the 17th century. And if we flip back to the last leaf at the back of the book, we can find here Thomas Bressi. And previous scholars have been able to date this from 1603 to 1625. Also, by the way, Robert Dacres is signed here as well. So, from these, you can see a bit of the history of a manuscript. But I also want to point out to you just how different the handwriting styles are. Now, we usually just call this the hand. You might have noticed that on certain old documents, like the Declaration of Independence, the hand is much different than the hand would be today. And although you might think this is due to it being a formal document, if you look at the personal letters from, say, people in the American Civil War, you may notice that the hand is a little strange to us today. They'll often write the characters a bit differently than we would. So even though there are only a few words here on this page, you can see several different types of hands with styles stretching out almost 3 centuries. In some cases, we can date a manuscript by internal references, and since this is a book of law, we can date it pretty precisely. But in cases where we can't tell when the manuscript was written by the evidence of the contents, we can look at the hand that it was written in. We call the academic study of handwriting paleography, and although individual handwriting styles certainly differ, general handwriting styles used in society tend to change together, so a good paleographer can often date a manuscript to within a quarter century just by studying the style of the hand. Okay, so let's look at the main text here. This style of handwriting that we see here is called the English cursive documentary script, or sometimes known as the English court hand. The court hand was used for centuries in a lot of legal writing, and over time it became really stylized, and it's hard for non-specialists to read. So it's fortunate for us that we already know when this manuscript was written. Now, even if a paleographer couldn't read Latin, they could still guess that this is probably a legal book based on the use of the court hand here and really throughout the book. You might have noticed that the handwriting is very straight along the page. Let me show you a few examples as we go through here, just how straight the handwriting is across the page. This is because the copyist pricked many light lines across the page. Sort of see here. Today we think of lined paper as being for things that are less prestigious, like a school assignment, while for something like a wedding invitation or a thank you letter, you would usually use unlined paper. But in the Middle Ages, it was different. If we look on the side of this page, you can see how along the margin, right here, along the margin you can see tiny holes, almost like it was perforated. We call this pricking, and they did this by using a knife or an awl to put these little holes and on the interior and exterior margins. Of course, now that the codex is bound, we can't see the interior prickings anymore, but we can see the exterior on many pages. We'll see some other pages that have this as well. Then, using a ruler, they could just press a light line into the manuscript leaf with a dull blade or a dry stylus, and they would have a line that the scribe could use to make their writing neat and tidy. let me find, I have a better page for you here. If you want to look, for example, at this page here, sort of see the lines across here, and you can sort of see they have little guidelines for themselves throughout that still remain on this page. Now, looking at the size of this manuscript, you might be thinking it seems too long to be the Magna Carta, and you'd be right. The Magna Carta runs about 3,600 words, or about 15 pages if you were to type it out like a standard double-spaced 12-point font paper, perhaps for a school assignment or something. This codex is well over 200 pages long, 200 leaves long. That's because the first 168 pages of this codex is a register of writs, which is basically a record of court orders. It's a legal reference work. Then on leaf 168, which I will open up to here, we go. It has a series of important legal documents that starts here. The first being a copy of the Magna Carta, which runs until here. Until here, followed by the Forest Charter and various statutes of the realm, all documents that were important because they established the rights of freemen. Now, you might also notice that the pages seem to be a lot thicker than in a paper book. It's not actually paper at all, but it's parchment made of vellum, made from the skins of animals. Now, because the word vellum technically only refers to cow skins and not sheep or goat, I generally use the word parchment. But in everyday conversation, people, including scholars, often use them interchangeably. But if you go into the craft store and buy parchment paper, that's not really parchment at all, but it's instead just a thicker paper made from plant products like paper. So how did animal skin from a goat, sheep, or cow then end up as something you could write on? Well, first, the skin would be soaked for several days in a lime solution to loosen the hairs. Then whatever hairs remained would be gently scraped off with a special blade, was kind of shaped like a half moon, and then washed again. The next step would be to dry it on a frame. Now they would put little pebbles around the edges of the skin and bundle them up into little pippins, and then tie the pippins to the frame with a cord. The skin had to be kept tight as it was drying, so they would occasionally tighten it up on the pegs, on the frame. They'd scrape it with that curved blade on both sides as it dried to get all the hairs that still remained and to give it the nice smooth texture that it has now. Now, in different places in this manuscript, you can see modeling on the pages. Let me see if I can find a couple of spots for you where that might be more visible to see. Find a good one. Oh, here we go. Here's a beautiful page here. So if you can see the modeling down here, these are from the original animal skin. Sometimes in manuscripts you can find neat little holes that are very neat little ovals. Not this kind of hole. This kind of hole is damage to the manuscript. But if we look, there's one back here. Find a good one for us. Here we go. You can find these neat little ovals or circles. So there's one here, and perhaps you can see that here. I'll put this back a little bit here. We have some here, right? These usually aren't damaged to the manuscript. Instead, these are pinpricks in the animal skin from something, maybe like a bug bite, that was so tiny they probably weren't visible when they began the process of stretching and drying, but they were made larger during that stretching and drying process. Now, one really helpful clue to know whether it is later damage or an original imperfection is whether the scribe wrote around it. If the scribe wrote around it, the hole is an imperfection in the parchment that was already there before they began. Now, once it was stretched and ready to go, they would trim the skin to be cut into sheets known as gatherings or quires. If you had a nice sized piece of cowhide, one of the most common ways to make a quire would be to cut it into a large rectangle. So we can imagine here, cut to a large rectangle, then you'd fold the rectangle vertically, and then horizontally, giving you 4 perfectly matched leaves. Now, of course, not every animal skin would be the right size for this, so we see quires are often made up of smaller pieces of parchment folded in 2, or even sometimes a single leaf attached. After the whole process of writing, collecting, and editing a book was done, the various gatherings or quires would all be sewn up together into a binding. Now, often these were just loose parchment bindings, kind of similar to paperback books would be today, but sometimes they were wooden covers like hardbound books. If you look at high-quality modern books, you can see that we still use quires to make books. So here's an example. This is from 1915, but I'm using it because it's damaged, so it's easy to see. If you look along the edge of the binding of a hardbound book, you can sort of see the different gatherings it was printed on here. And all these were sewn or glued together. Now this practice that we still do today harkens back to the way this manuscript and others like it were made. Now some scholars have estimated that a calf skin could yield about 3.5 sheets, and of course smaller animals like a sheep or goat would yield less. So a book like this would have taken dozens of skins to make. So as you can see, one of the 2 main reasons books were so expensive in the Middle Ages. Not only were they very labor intensive to copy by hand, but the raw materials were much more valuable than a similar paper book would be today. Now, here we have one of the things people love about medieval manuscripts, a decorated initial letter. Okay. Now, although people love to see these, the truth is that most medieval manuscripts don't have these kinds of decorations. So when you see a decorated manuscript, you know that this was considered a more prestigious book worthy of this extra effort. So we have more we have lots of little ones in here. You can see one here. But throughout this book, there are many beautiful decorations. Here in, so see this one here, very nice. It's a very nice one. Not a surprise, this is the one that begins the Magna Carta itself. Okay. Okay, so moving along, if you took the time to copy the book like this would not be copied, this kind of decoration that we see here wouldn't be copied by the first scribe. Instead, what would happen would be a later artist would come and they'd add the initial letter and any other decorations. Now you'll notice, if we look at the book here, you notice that the lines have to be set off to make room for the decoration. So this had to be planned when the scribe was copying the manuscript, and by putting a little box around where the letter would go. Now occasionally we'll find manuscripts that have empty boxes where they had planned to come back and add the decorated letters, but for some reason they never got around to it. Now, of course, this manuscript has many beautiful decorated initials, but it also has something even more special, illumination. Although we sometimes use the word illumination to mean any kind of decoration, technically an illuminated manuscript is one that uses gold or silver foil in it. If we look closely at this part of this letter, we can see that this part is not ink, but it's instead a gold foil pressed against the page, which is an even greater sign that this is a prestigious book. If we go to the beginning of the Magna Carta itself, it's even easier to see that. If we can look down here, one moment. Unfortunately for the manuscript, but fortunately for us to see it, the beginning of the Magna Carta, this little beginning here, you can see the foil has flaked off here. So you can see this is actually part of, it's not an ink, but part of this gold foil that was pressed onto here. So of course, there's so much more to learn about medieval manuscripts, but I hope that this gives you a glimpse into what medieval manuscript scholars see when we're looking at one. I'd like to thank the Troy University Library for providing access to this beautiful manuscript. And on behalf of Troy University, we'd like to thank the Remnant Trust for loaning us this manuscript for exhibition. Thank you very much.